There's just this one time he got out of prison, couldn't get a job. He's a good friend of mine, and he, couldn't get a job, was like, I'll just sell some crack just this once. And there were a bunch of guys, it was a break on the street, like between workshops, and they were talking about parole. He's like, what's up? And then he's like, come upstairs, got a sandwich, got obsessed. We had a service model that worked. There was employment, but it was also a goal setting model that helped people find the next step in their life.
Welcome to another episode of the Mindfulness Experience Podcast. We're thrilled to introduce our esteemed guest today. For today's episode, Mr. Adam Friedman. Adam holds the distinguished position of Senior Director of Programs at the renowned David Lynch Foundation. His role involves shaping and implementing programs that help individuals harness the power of meditation and mindfulness. He offers transformative experiences to those from all walks of life. So this is going to be very exciting. He has a wealth of knowledge and expertise, and we're going to dive into some of the enlightening discussions around mindfulness and using meditation and its benefits and how it can be integrated into daily life. So sit back, relax, and welcome Mr. Adam Friedman to our podcast. Hey, Adam, all right. Welcome, Adam. How are you? How you doing?
Good, it's nice to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you here. I'd like to just kind of jump into it because you've got a lot of stuff to share about your journey. Can you share your journey from being an advertising copywriter to working with social service providers at the David Lynch Foundation, and really maybe perhaps some of the key moments that led to your shift and what you're doing, what you're up to in terms of research and programs?
Oh, okay. That's a big one. I'll start. When I was a kid, I loved TV commercials. I liked the idea of writing ads. I never thought I could because I didn't have any experience, but I was an insurance analyst, and I said, what the heck, I'll give it a try. And I got lucky. I got a job and I wrote ads for a bunch of years. And it got to the point I was like, I feel like I'm a net negative on society. And I was like, life was flying by, and I had traveled for a little bit. I wasn't really psyched to travel, but it slowed down life. And I said, what the heck? I quit my job. I went to South America for 3 months, and I said, I tried freelancing and advertising when I got back, because I didn't want to do that full for a job, but I didn't know what I want to do. And experiences traveling and got me, and for 3 months, just showed me there was another dimension to life. And it got me, I was like, it was a dimension of something mental. You could get to a higher state or something. And that got me into meditation. And I freelance, so for about 7 years, I do some ad jobs when they showed up, and I traveled to India or wherever for a few months when I got when I felt like it. And I decided, I got into meditation. That's a longer, I had a lot of troubles. Like I thought I was a terrible meditator, but I just believed in it so strongly. I kept at it for years. And I came to the conclusion, like, I'm not fulfilled in advertising. I don't want to do. And I thought the cliche, I remember seeing George Costanza say this on Seinfeld, like, helping people, that's the answer. And so it was kind of selfish. I was like, okay, I can help people to be fulfilled. And I ended up getting a job at the Coalition for the Homeless. And I worked in homelessness, domestic violence, prisoner reentry. I was very into prison work, and I worked for a lot of years in New York, New Jersey, and volunteered in jails in New York. And I was really into meditation, and I was working in a government social service job in North Jersey government, and helping people didn't go well together. I remember I looked and I saw an ad for a job. It was the David Lynch Foundation, and it was, they used meditation for like homeless people who were homeless, domestic violence survivors, veterans with PTSD. I remember I read the job. I told my son, he was 12, and he just goes, "That's you."
That's you.
And I told that story at my interview, and
Uh-huh.
I never had thought of meditation as an intervention to heal trauma. That was in social services, like a lot of times we would fail. Like, it's hard work, and usually often you don't change people's lives. And a lot of the reason is underlying trauma, especially in the prisoner reentry population. But, domestic violence, homelessness, it's there.
Right.
And looking at the research getting in here, I was really psyched about it. I was like, meditation, I'd really come for a while. I was like, I want to bring meditation to the world. This is the answer. And then I came to the conclusion, I'm not going to change the world if I can't change myself, and I'm not where I need to be. So forget about that. And then I realized, okay, using this to heal trauma, it's not this global changing thing. It's on an individual basis. It is related, obviously. Yeah. And so it's like using meditation to heal trauma, I think, can be a fundamental addition in the social service sector. And that's what we do at the David Lynch Foundation. We work with domestic violence service providers. We work in, one of the most violent plague areas of Washington, D.C. We work with veterans and first responders with PTSD, partnering with like the fire department of New York's counseling services unit, because I never thought about firefighters. I thought of them as like heroes and not the people who'd seen, a lot of death and destruction and have 20 years of images in their head. And transcendental meditation, I've been kind of amazed how not in everyone, but a lot of people can profoundly and quickly address PTSD symptoms. So that's what we do. And I do a lot with the research. We do a lot of research here, so it's a lot of effort to measure that. I was studied math. That's kind of my part of my thing. So that's kind of what I do in the shortish version of how I got here.
Wow, that's great. And, I love the fact that you're involved with research, and you've worked with a diverse group of people, such as homeless individuals, formerly incarcerated men and women, domestic violence survivors, and welfare beneficiaries. Can you share some of the most profound experiences, perhaps, of some of the transformations you've witnessed and some of the research that you've done? I mean, one of the things that I'm certainly aware of is trauma. We've got implicit and explicit trauma that happens within our society. I mean, even a kid that, mommy and daddy went to the bathroom or they didn't pick them up from school at the right time can be traumatized. But you're really talking about some heavy duty stuff here, certainly, in terms of incarceration and people who are just not able to show up in some ways, not only for their own life, but have maladaptive behaviors and are really dealing with some really serious, as you say, some serious images and some serious imprints. Can you talk about that and maybe some of the transformations that you've seen?
Let's see. I'll give a little I'll start with meditation and then go into, I have stories throughout the years from prisoner reentry. Like, my favorite one actually was a guy who showed up on the way to a crack deal and stumbled upon our agency and on
a crack deal. Oh my goodness. Wow.
Just this one time he got out of prison, couldn't get a job. He's a good friend of mine he couldn't get a job, was like, I'll just sell some crack just this once, and walked by the prison reentry agency I was working at in East Harlem, and there were a bunch of guys. It was a break on the street, like between workshops, and they were talking about parole. He's like, "What's up?" And then he's like, "Come upstairs." Got a sandwich. Got obsessed. We had a service model that worked. There was employment, but it was also a goal-setting model that helped people find the next step in their life. And he went from his daughter he was not allowed to see her. It was with his drug addicted ex-wife, and he ended up reconnecting with her. Her life changed. She became Olympic hopeful, now as a nurse.
Wow.
And I could trace it back, and he said, like, this changed my life and I wouldn't have been anywhere near there. And he's just raised a lot of money for charity, started a career, has like a whole family, 10 kids were living with him. He got married, him and his wife each had 3 kids. They had a bunch of other kids. He's like the best father ever.
Wow.
And that was, turning it around. And you have stories like that. Like I'd see, people in domestic violence, like when I worked in another agency in East Harlem that helped domestic violence survivors, and you see usually women who'd come in and they just had no self-esteem left. And they'd be like, you got to help me with everything. And then finally they're like, I can do this. I can take, and they more like come for advice and do, and have the belief that I can make it in the world, as opposed to like this abuser controls me because I'm worthless and without him, I'm nothing. And you see that, like, I see that though a lot more at David Lynch Foundation. Like we have a program, we've done hundreds, trained hundreds of domestic violence survivors in TM through a partnership with the city of New York. And you see, we do evaluations, and I see the one thing I see, like we see a reduction in anxiety and anger and fatigue. But what we do when we measure these, we also ask, like, just an open-ended question: what's the biggest change you've seen because of transcendental meditation? And I have dozens and dozens and dozens of like, I can't believe I'm, more confident. I have less trauma symptoms. I just, I'm more focused on it. It's just person. I'm not saying every single person, but one after the other. I read them. I talk to people at work. If you're ever depressed at work and you're like, oh, I got to deal with, let's face it, it's work. You got to deal with BS. I'm like, just here's pages and pages, just skim through them for a few minutes and you'll realize how much we're changing people's lives. And that's, I had someone here, she, ran our domestic violence survivor program. She was a teacher at TM. People loved her, and she was thinking of becoming a social worker. And I worked with social workers in East Harlem. I loved the place. It was called Steps to End Family Violence. And it was great. Like, what's
the name of it?
Steps to End Family Violence. We worked with, legal services and counseling. We worked at Rikers Island with incarcerated survivors, which a lot of people have experienced abuse there. It was great. It was just a wonderful place. And she said to me, I'm thinking of going to social work school, become a social worker. And I said to her, you would be an awesome social worker, but you will do so much more for domestic violence survivors, teaching them transcendental meditation from what I've seen.
Now, I want to get into like what transcendental meditation is. But before we go there, one of the things you're talking about, this is very heavy. And one of the things that your bio mentioned is that well-intentioned social interventions fail to lead to positive outcomes. Can you elaborate on this? What are some of the common shortcomings that you've observed in the interventions that are out there today? And how does TM, Transcendental Meditation, offer another approach? Because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about the fellow, who was, the system failed him in some respect. He was out there and he was walking by one of the meetings and all of a sudden his life has changed. You really believe in it. You found some development for your own self, but it's really about, what is the system missing that really, from the TM viewpoint, really allows them in some way to be empowered to really take, charge of their life, take hold and agency of their lives. And where's the shortcomings? So, what's happening?
I just want to tweak one thing you said.
Sure.
Fails to produce outcomes, not always. Like there are, I've seen life changes in my career in social services. That was one example, and there are others. It's just really hard, and a lot of people don't take to it, and I think I don't say the system failed them, but I'd say a major shortcoming is that someone comes in, let's say you get out of prison, you need a job, no question, they agree, I need a job, you need a job. Then they come to a reentry service, they give you, resume help and employment assistance, and those are great service you need. But if you, experience child abuse, more abuse in prison, you're emotionally dysregulated, you prone to anger outbursts, you have feelings of worthlessness because of all this trauma, like often you're just not going to succeed. You're going to give up. You're afraid of, the rejection at a job, like you're rejected from 2 jobs. You've experienced rejection. It's triggering. This trauma makes it really hard for this to take in a lot of people. Not that it doesn't work for anyone. It's worth doing. And the question is, what do you do with that? Like, for PTSD specifically, there's some treatments. They're not cures. They work on some people, but often they're counseling related. They don't really fit to employ with most social service agencies. Like if you had someone doing exposure therapy, which is not as effective, I think, on childhood trauma for one, and it wouldn't have worked with us in the reentry agency, like go into counseling, but what you can do is we had a series of 2-week workshops. Could you have meditation as one of those workshops, and specifically like Transcendental Meditation? We're doing that in Washington, D.C. Actually, there's an organization takes, kids they're not kids, they're young adults in general, and gives them employment services. And they have like a month, I think it's like 6 weeks of training. We incorporate Transcendental Meditation. So every cohort gets that. That can help with your trauma symptoms. And if you're more emotionally regulated, less prone to anger outbursts, and all the other, you pause before reacting, which is one of the benefits of TM. Your sleep is often better, which has all sorts of positive benefits. Are you going to succeed in employment and have these services work better for you? Not everyone, but a lot more likely. And that's the piece that I like. What I learned from working at David Lynch Foundation and in my, other social services, not including meditation, is I think that's could be a really effective combination. In a lot of organizations, we do that. And, we partner in general. We partner with VA hospitals. In the pandemic, we started working with, burnout healthcare workers. We, had taught meditation in over 70 hospitals around the country, and work with domestic violence service providers, addiction treatment centers. And this, I think, it really works in incorporating.
So, I hear everything you're saying, and a lot of the listeners may be, wondering, okay, well, what is this TM? Because we work with people who have trauma from a meditation viewpoint, and, many people from a trauma sensitive perspective can't sit in meditation. You ask them to sit for 5 minutes or 8 minutes, they can't sit in meditation. They just have a hard time sitting with themselves. And many people who are traumatized, really are very reactive to their environments, reactive to noises, reactive to things that are going on. They're living life, what I call living life from the outside in rather than from the inside out. So I'm wondering, as we take a look at it, all of this trauma plays a significant role. Can you talk about the effects of trauma, maybe perhaps the way you've seen it? And from the viewpoint of TM, what are the interventions like? Because, they are different than many others. And, certainly that's the way it's marketed, if you will. The advertising spin on it is this is different than other meditation types.
Yeah.
So can you talk to that for a few moments?
Yeah, I wanted to preface it with that. I'm not saying TM is better or more effective. Like there's not the research to say that head to head, but the technique has a fundamental difference from most mindfulness techniques. And I'd say mindfulness, like in general, is, what you're trying to do is focus on something which keeps you in the present moment and do it non-judgmental. That basically,
right. Generally speaking, that's the breath, the body, the emotion, maybe a mantra, maybe, some sort of a word but it's generally speaking for a period of time, right? Yes. It's not necessarily wherever you go, wherever you walk, although it should be. It can be, but it's not necessarily a part of the rigor in terms of the training, because people come in, sit down for 20 minutes or, 10 minutes or whatever it is. But go on, please.
Okay. So one of the key things there, I'm not saying it's the key to mindfulness, but the difference is you're trying to focus. And I remember when I first learned TM, I meditated for a lot of years before that. And I said I was at the David Lynch Foundation, and they said, TM, there's no effort to focus. And I said to my boss, who was a TM teacher, I'm like, how could you focus without trying? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And he said, which was annoying, but a good answer, learn the technique and you'll understand. And what it is, you have a mantra in TM, like, that's not so different. Let's say it was kablum, I'll make one of those. But the key is, you're not trying to think the mantra. The technique they teach you is it automatically pops into your head. Like if you just thought, oh, I forgot to call Joe this morning. That thought popped in your head. There was no effort. If I said to you, pay attention to your breath, you might not try too hard, but there'd be some effort to bring your attention to your breath. In TM, there's no effort. And so it sort of automatically pops into your head. So that's a key difference. It's effortless. And what a lot of people find, and not everyone, but that's easier. I remember one of the first things I tried TM. I was like, I could tell you my story. I had done Vipassana for 18 years and I tried TM. And one of my first thoughts I remember is, I hope this works because it's easier than Vipassana. I love Vipassana, don't get me wrong. It changed my life. It's great. And so there's an ease to it because you're not really trying to do anything. And one of the things that's good, they really focus on what happens in your meditation doesn't matter. And if you're a trauma survivor, often, especially childhood trauma, picture you think you have a feeling of worthlessness. Now someone says, try and focus on your breath and you'll get to this state. And a lot of people don't. I didn't succeed for a while. And then like that triggering, like I suck, I'm bad, I can't do this. If your message is there's no goal and it's just going to repeat in your head and it does, and like there's no good or bad, that can be freeing for trauma survivors and be like, oh. And so we find, I can't say everyone, but it's amazing. People with PTSD, I don't teach TM, but often it's like a 4-day course, Monday through Thursday, about an hour and a half a day. And I sit sometimes like I did with an addiction treatment friend, right? I'm at the fire department a few weeks ago, the last day of the course. And we get very low dropout in the 4 days, and everyone's sitting for the meditation pretty much like they don't. And these are high trauma populations with PTSD. TM tends to be pretty easy for trauma survivors. And I think the difference is the effortlessness, which is easier, and hey, it doesn't matter what happens. And people don't, it takes a while to get that because they're like, of course it matters what happens, especially if you've done other meditation. But those are the fundamental differences in TM from mindfulness. So now whether it works better for PTSD or those are separate questions, but those are in the process, I think it's different. And I could see how that would, trauma survivors can sit easier with that.
Right. So we go back to the whole idea of regulation or lack of, regulation, hyper arousal, hypoarousal, you're dysregulated, something's going on. And from the standpoint of open awareness, open awareness is another technique, but it's all inclusive of open awareness of what's going on right now. Where am I? Where, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, my body, my feelings, your expressions, whatever it is. And what you're saying is that within that open awareness, you automatically move into the awareness of your mantra and whatever comes into your mind at that moment. I'm still a little confused.
Good question.
Because if you're aware, are we saying that the mantra is sort of the anchor? Because we use anchors, various types of anchors. It could be your fingers or your mudra, the sound of your breath, the sound of chimes, the sound of the whatever. Okay, so I'm just trying to trying to catch the wind here. Yeah.
An anchor, I think of it different. I'm not a TM teacher, but I think of it different as an anchor. It's just more of a process. Like they would say, generally, when the mantra is repeating in your head, you don't always stay there. It doesn't matter if you stay there. And there's a real emphasis on, and if your mantra is repeating in your head, fine. If it stops and you wander off, fine. But there's not a goal of staying on it. And it doesn't matter whether you do. And if you get and feel that way, it almost feels like, I like a quote from one person I read in a book on TM, was like, you can't do it wrong. And it's not, you can get the feeling like open awareness, great. And you can have whatever comes into mind is fine, but it could be taught in a way where your goal is awareness. And then you have a goal and you could fail. If you have a goal, you can fail at it. If you don't have a goal, well, there's nothing to fail at. And so TM, they teach it in a way, it doesn't matter what happens. Whatever's happening has a purpose. Whether or not that's right or wrong, you can debate, but that's sort of, you have that attitude towards meditation, it's taught that way, then there's not a goal to be aware of anything. You just do this process. It's almost if, and if whatever you're experiencing, it doesn't matter. Now you could say, well, how could that make sense? You're supposed to be in a certain state. Well, they would say in TM, that's not the case. And they have they kind of say, your mind's off, you're releasing stress. If your mind's on, you're doing this, and whatever's happening is sort of supposed to happen. Right. And if you buy into that, which there's some sense to it, but you might not. But if you buy into that, then you're like, okay, I can't screw up. It's almost like when you I think of it like, let's say you go for dialysis, you have a kidney problem. Go to the dialysis, you have to get there, you have to get through the traffic. But once you plug in the doctor plugs in dialysis, your job's done. You can't do it wrong. It might work, it might not. You might still have kidney problems, but you've done your job. And sort of the message in TM is once you start doing it for the 20 minutes, you did your job. Don't worry about what happens. Right. And if you feel that way, it can be freeing, especially for someone with a low self-worth.
Now, isn't the mantra that you get like your own secret little mantra? You're not supposed to tell anybody about your mantra?
They say don't tell anyone, and the reasons they give, I'll say some people are fine with that, some people hate it, but I think the good reason for that, I think, is I've gone online, like a key to TM is effortless. It's like, it's almost like if you didn't have the effortlessness, it's not TM. And a couple of times I've been like, let's see online, like explanations of TM. That's not how you're supposed to learn. And I couldn't believe it. I looked in 3 places, like explaining, here's how you do TM. And none of them mentioned the effortlessness. And I was like, if you give someone a mantra, and maybe it works. I mean, there are types of mantra meditations that don't have effortless, but they're clearly not TM. And so one of the reasons is some people will be like, oh, you just say this. And if you tried to teach your friend TM, you'd probably do a bad job of it. And I think one of the reasons they tell people not to tell anyone your mantra is they don't want people trying to teach TM and then people go, oh, I learned TM, it didn't work, it's no good. And they didn't really learn TM. TM is also, so that's one of the reasons you don't get your own, like people's are different, but there's like I don't know if there's how many there are, but I don't teach TM, but there's a limited number, but they're big on that. I can't talk to people's motivation, but I think that's a reasonable motivation to be like, they don't want people teaching TM, and who don't teach it right. And how awful it's explained online, I was just sort of shocked. So I'm like, there's an argument that even if you explain it well, it's an experiential one-on-one thing, but if you explain it that awfully, it's like explaining, Zen meditation without telling people they have to, sit. I mean, there's walking meditation. I don't have a good.
It's a whole it's an experiential process, and for those people who don't really, our listeners who don't really understand what a mantra is, can you? I mean, it's basically a recitation of a certain number of words that are personally or empowering to you. That as an individual, that's the way I would explain it. How would you explain a mantra?
Well, it's I'd say in TM, a mantra is, they'd say, a sound. I mean, it can be, some mantras are words and some are sounds. Then they'd say it's a sound. And the idea, they say, and they wouldn't say you repeat it, they would say you think it. It's a thought. So it's like, let's say your mantra was kablum, I'm making one up. Then the thought kablum would pop in your head. What does that do? They would say using a mantra effortlessly in the correct way helps you. It's sort of like a key, almost the mantra. The effortlessness is how you use it. And there's certain, details and specifics in that. And the mantra is almost the key that unlocks so you can sink deeper into your mind to a where there's a deeper level of calm. That's what they say. And when you sink in there, you can we all have junk in our mind and it helps release it. I would say that's not that's how I'm not, just for the record, I'm not a TM teacher, and TM is very systematic and they have ways they describe things, but that's kind of how I would describe in TM what a mantra is.
So can you talk to a little bit about where this comes from? Because, there are, from the standpoint of those people that might be hearing about TM, it's not the first time. I mean, the Beatles went to India back in the 60s, right? They learned TM. Then you have a sort of an outgrowth of that. You have the Art of Living with Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, who teaches Sudarshan Kriya. And that's sort of another branch or another tree or another limb on the TM, wheel. But can you give some perspective around that if you're able to, that is?
Yeah, I mean, I can give some, like in the 50s, the Beatles learned in India. Right. There was a guy, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. He taught it in India. He had learned it there from a line of people. And he came to the West and I think the United States, and he taught, he popularized it. He taught a lot of people. I think Beatles learned, some famous people learned, which gave it a lot of press. And he, trained a lot of TM teachers. And then that sort of, through the years, they had TM centers where you could go and learn TM around country and around the world in different cities, and eventually there was, they focused on research a decent amount for meditation. Right. I think he was supposedly a physicist or something also, and a monk, so he was into research, I guess, and that trickled, down. And that was, there's been some, variety of really good to, like preliminary, not so good research. There have been hundreds of studies on it. And then eventually the David Lynch Foundation was formed, and it's sort of like, let's do that. You could pay for TM, and David Lynch, what I love, I'm in the free TM business. So David Lynch Foundation raises money from both government and private donors, and it's really helps with trauma. So we work with high stress and high trauma populations. And that's sort of a related to TM centers. Like I had a program where we had veterans would come to us around the country and want to learn TM because they had, trauma issues, and we would connect them with TM centers and pay for it. And we used to do that. Now we're doing a big TM study with veterans. We're not doing that anymore. And we would measure the reduction in trauma, depression, improved sleep, which all really, I remember starting at David Lynch Foundation and getting the data in, and it was like for me, it was like Christmas, and like working with spreadsheets, look at the drop in trauma at 1 month, like 51% reduction. And so that's sort of been the ancient, I don't know how far back it goes, I know but it supposedly goes back, they say it goes back,
well, thousands and thousands of years back into the, into the Vedic systems in terms of understanding, but more importantly, I think what you've mentioned here, and I want to lift that up a little bit, is the secular perspective and the scientific perspective. I think probably my understanding is that, whether or not it's David Lynch or TM in general has been researched and studied, and there are scientific papers on it that really, peer-reviewed studies that really show the impact and the efficacy of transcendental meditation in terms of working with populations that have stress and trauma. So can you lift that up a little bit in terms of maybe perhaps, I don't know if you've got some of the numbers or whether or not.
I could tell you a little
some of that, because you're involved with some of that research, right?
Oh yeah, I'm doing research. I have a meeting at 11 on on our Columbia study. So I work most with trauma research, and that's some of the strongest research on TM. There's some big, I'll say the biggest study was done at the San Diego VA. The Department of Defense gave $2.3 million to see how TM works compared to what they normally use for PTSD. And the gold standard treatment in the VA is called prolonged exposure. And basically, if you had a IED go off in Iraq and you have PTSD, what they do at the VA is one of their top treatment is they have you relive that to sort of desensitize you. It's like facing your fears. Like you get homework, watch a video of a bomb going off, which is very triggering, but you watch enough bombs go off, supposedly your trauma symptoms reduce. That helps some people. A lot of people drop out, not surprisingly, and they're like, well, TM, you don't talk about your trauma or deal with your trauma at all. Let's compare TM to prolonged exposure and see if TM works as well for veterans with PTSD. And made a study of 203 veterans with PTSD, and it turned out TM was, the scientific term is non-inferior, but means worked as well as prolonged exposure. And actually, in the study, TM was more effective than prolonged exposure, but it wasn't statistically significantly better. So they just say it was non-inferior. And they also had a third group of like PTSD education, and TM was a lot better than that. So that was the big study. They also, Northwell at the they have a behavioral health clinic for veterans, and they did a study on TM versus their normal treatment for veterans with PTSD. And TM was a lot better. And there's a scientific term for a lot better. I don't know if you have scientists here. It's called high effect size, not only in PTSD, but in anxiety, depression, and sleep. And TM was a lot better in the San Diego study, and depression also. So those are the two big PTSD studies.
Wow.
There's a bunch of others that are some are impressive, but they're just not as impressive for different reasons. They did a couple studies on prisoners, on a couple hundred people in prisons on trauma symptoms, but they didn't diagnose them with PTSD. And they were, it was a randomized control trial. They looked at half the people, and that was an improvement in trauma symptoms. And there have been others. We do a lot of work with, in the pandemic, we started with healthcare workers. There's, huge stress. And we've kind of seen in several studies, there's one at Duke, it was a randomized control trial that looked at TM, and randomly they selected healthcare workers, either you get TM or you don't. And there was reduction in anxiety and burnout. One of the key elements of burnout is emotional exhaustion. And there was a reduction. So compared to controls, burnout and emotional exhaustion. And there have been a couple other studies, one at 3 hospitals in Florida that was called, wasn't randomly selected, but they compared healthcare workers, who got TM and healthcare workers who didn't, and they had similar results to the randomized controls trial.
Wow.
There've been a bunch of other, like they've done a lot of the NIH has spent something like $23 million on studies on heart disease and high blood pressure, and it appears TM, lowers blood pressure, especially in older adults. So, and they've done those are the areas I'm most familiar with, PTSD most, but they've done a lot of other studies. What you got to be careful with research is when you hear this study showed X, there's, it may not, you got to really dig in. And a lot of the other areas, there's a lot of things that people with brain waves that, in TM, and I just don't like quoting those because I'm not an expert on neuroscience where I can read a study and be like, okay, that seems fishy or whatever, so I don't like quote. I'm not saying TM is more fishy than other research. I'm just saying research can be preliminary. You'll be like, okay, this suggests something, but I wouldn't quote it. There's sort of a step in the evidence chain. And on PTSD, we're now at the highest level. We're doing a multi-site study with 6 different sites with a bunch of Columbia, USC, a bunch of others. It's a randomized control trial. I mean, we're in the midst of it, on PTSD and veterans and first responders. So if you're at the bottom level of the evidence chain, that's important to do, but it's important not to quote the people and say, we've shown it works on creativity. Maybe it does. And I don't know enough there's been hundreds of TM studies. I don't know about a lot of the areas, but the areas that we work with at David Lynch Foundation, I have a better idea.
Well, that's wonderful. As a vet, I'm very interested. As you well know, we talked about this. I'm a healthcare ambassador with the Heroic Hearts Project as a vet. And what we do is we work with vets who have PTSD and trauma, but we're specifically working with them to help them reboot, reset, reframe with psychedelics, the use of psychedelics, because we're helping them to stop the default mode network, to reboot and relook at some traumas from a distance, and then allow them to go ahead and assimilate those, or to provide a different frame on them so that they can be more normalized. Now, the thing that I'm more interested in is how do we activate that normalization? How do we activate that reintegration, if you will, of whatever that trauma was. And that's where I believe, and that's what my book was about, the Mindfulness Experience. It's the name of the podcast, but it's all about using the VHA model, which is really about understanding the internal infrastructure, the mind, the body, the spirit, the breath. In other words, what we put in our bodies, energy, as well as sleep. So those 5 key inner components. And then how does that impact us in terms of our outer world? In other words, our relationships, our environment, or our aspirations. So they all work in tandem as 8 strategies. But, the research is there that really shows that mindfulness or breath work, or in your case, the research around TM, which is a component of one of the tools in the toolbox, if you will, around mindfulness, because there's been a lot of studies about that, that it really does help individuals to reboot, reset, reframe in the moment. So you're coming back to the moment, you're coming back to your own sense of empowerment, your own sense of empowerment, and then you're allowing yourself to be embodied in that experience. So within your work, I'm wondering if you can share what your view is in terms of incorporating transcendental meditation into the structure of the work that you've been doing. Are there challenges? Are there obstacles in terms of doing that? What do you see as the evolution of this work that the David Lynch Foundation is doing, and how do you believe that these studies can be, more mainstreamed, if you will, kind of going forward? I know there's a lot to unpack there, but maybe you can talk to that.
One of the overall goals of the David Lynch Foundation is to, we're in the free TM business, but we raise money, like, our CEOs talking to like hedge fund guys or whoever, raising money to do it. And that's limited. We're a nonprofit. One of the goals is to leverage this research to get insurance reimbursement for TM and show this is a, medical intervention that should be used for whether it's PTSD. There's all sorts of different, that's the bureaucracy of it. And we're working with certain firms to figure out what research do we need, what, regulations do we have to do to get there. So that's a way to expand it.
So insurance.
I'm more in the programs. How can you use this? I think, I always say, you said, use the term tool in the toolbox, which I think is it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's perfect in a lot of ways. But I think of TM as more of the toolbox, because I think it can help other interventions. So for instance, like I want personally something that, and this is one thing the David Lynch Foundation is working on. It's not central to our work, but it's, for me, I think could be a game changer, is combine TM with other psychotherapies. For instance, for trauma, they have, there's prolonged exposure I talked about, but another one, EMDR. And it's you have to think about your trauma, but one of the problems is it can be hard for a lot of people to do that. They're triggered. They go, what they say is to make these treatments work and to directly process traumas, you need what's called a window of tolerance between hyper arousal, where you're like, this is too much, I can't think about that bomb going off, or disassociation, where you're just, as a defense mechanism, you shut down your emotions, and then, you shut down, you can't process it. And what TM amazingly does, I've seen this, like when in the fourth day of a course, people learn TM on Monday and now it's Thursday. And I'm hearing from them, and over, people say, something happened, it would have normally triggered me and I wasn't triggered. And it's not like we give them a breathing technique or something to do in the moment. It's almost like if you couldn't lift the table in your office, you worked out for 6 months and then you tried to lift the table, you're just like, oh, wow, that got easy. Did the table get lighter? No, but you've been working out. And this TM really helped. There's not research on this specifically, but I've just seen it with my own eyes enough that you don't, or not everyone, but a lot of people just find they're not responding to triggers in the same way. That I think puts them in that window of tolerance where a psychotherapy that directly deals with your trauma. So I think they come at trauma from different directions, dealing with the memory directly and maybe providing a base of calm. So I think TM before other treatments, and I think psychedelics is potentially as well, but I have less theory behind why that would work with psychedelics, like this window of tolerance.
Right.
I like both treatments and I see the effectiveness. I love the idea of seeing how they work together, but first line psychotherapies, I think TM could enhance them. And then if your first line treatment is enhanced, you have a new first line treatment.
Right.
So TM can work on,
And I really like the window of tolerance, this idea that, in a flow state, in a normal state, we can sort of ride the wave, if you will. And, when we're hyper aroused, we have a high degree of the wave and we can get flooded and, get have a lot of anxiety and fight or flight and so on and so forth. And when we're hypo aroused, we can get sort of crashed by the wave. And then all of a sudden, all we want to do is retreat, maybe have some bonbons and so on and so forth. But, when we look at what you're talking about, I always talk about it in terms of, recognition and response, or stimulus response, recognition and choice, right? I mean, because within that gap between the stimulus and response, we do have a choice. So basically what the process is doing, as I understand you talking about, and I talk about this in terms of other mindfulness techniques, but you're talking about it like, this is not a technique. This is something that sort of is embedded in your psyche.
Yeah,
and, it's very different. And you do get that, stimulus response. You're aware of your stimulus. You're aware that you have more of the gap, and you're able to go ahead and make a different choice.
I wouldn't put it that way, because choice is, here's how I put you. If you had a choice and which is fine. Sometimes people are like, in theory you have a choice, but I don't. I just jump on people. But it's not like that people are necessarily making a choice. Sometimes you just hear, I didn't have that reaction. Normally it pops up. And so it's almost like, embedded in a way where you don't think about it. It's just almost like it's the opposite of it's not really a skill, but it's just sort of like people are surprised. They're just like, I normally would have yelled at them. And it's not like I had an intellectual, I have a choice, let me pause. It's just you find yourself doing it unintentionally, and it's good. People are happy about that. They're just sort of surprised. So it's not a strategy that's, that you do in the moment, like stop and think. It just sort of happens. That's when people describe it that way. So that's why I'd say I don't like, you have a choice, maybe you don't, but it's not like people are making a choice. They're just.
Well, great. And, I think what you've done is you've helped pique people's interest in TM, certainly. And I'm wondering, from your viewpoint, just sort of finally, what advice would you give social service providers, or anyone for that matter, working with trauma impacted individuals to help them affect lasting change? Would you say, go out, take a TM course? Would you say, that could be certainly one of the options, but I'm just wondering, where you see individuals, dealing with the frustration of everyday life, because, there's a lot. I believe that we're living at a time where we've got societal trauma, whether or not it's implicit or explicit, whether or not it's through our media, through our TV or movies, whether or not it's TikTok or, Instagram or Facebook, we're seeing more and more the window of tolerance being stretched, so much so that it's almost not even normal to be within the window of tolerance. A lot of times it's sort of, what we see is, a lot of death and destruction from a lot of the news. It's a 24-hour news cycle. And then within the impact of homelessness and helplessness and, so on and so forth, we see a lot of that just happening within society. Maybe it's just the news. Some people would say our society overall, the world overall, is much better than it ever was.
There's that argument.
And that's the other counter argument. And I can go there. But, what are your thoughts about this in terms of giving anyone some of the tools, or, maybe people that aren't able to go to the David Lynch Foundation or want to go there? What would be your suggestion, sort of as we look at a takeaway from our time together?
Well, are you talking about suggestions for a social service provider, what they do with People with trauma or individuals with trauma?
Well,
Those are two
both.
different
It could be both. I think coming out of the social services side of things, you certainly have a perspective about
Okay,
that.
I do. So let me start there.
And maybe for the everyday man who's listening to this, who's not a part of the social services, community, maybe what they can do. Do you have any thoughts about that as we start to wrap this up?
Yeah, I'll say in the social service community, obviously TM I'm a fan of, and I think that's something to explore. But it's if you're not, if you're not working with the David Lynch Foundation, you have to pay for it, and that's can be an issue. They don't have funding for that. What I would say is there's a big movement on organizations become trauma informed. And what the focus of that is, if you had trauma, usually it's an issue of power and control. Like people have, I was bullied as a kid, that's not a heavy trauma compared to child abuse, but sexual abuse, domestic violence. There's a dynamic of power and control that an abuser is putting on someone, and you feel helpless. And that power and control dynamic in trauma survivors can be very triggering. So if you're working with people, you want to give them as much choice as possible, as opposed to telling them everything they need to do. Like if you come into a social service agency and you're like, here's our process, do this, do this, do this. You might realize, okay, they have to do this, and do this, but how can I do it in a way where I'm not telling them everything to do? I'm giving them choices, and that can be less triggering. And then you get less all sorts of problems. They won't as much want to leave. So there's ways an agency can become trauma informed with training, but that lens that give people as much choice in their services within your service model. And, so thinking about it that way, and you won't trigger people, and you won't necessarily know why. People are like blowing up at you, you're just like, that guy's a nut. Well, if you really dug in, maybe you could have avoided that by certain things. Sometimes you can't, and you're going to get, you're dealing with a high trauma population, you'll have some issues, and that's part of it. We used to say, and at Exodus Transitional Community, at prison reentry, this is the population we work with. Like our CEO was done 12 years in prison, and sometimes things that go wrong, and people that have things, and we were second, third, fifth chances, But so that's what I'd say from an individual standpoint. I think TM's great for trauma. I will say, last thing I'll say, if you have PTSD and you go to a TM center, you want to learn it. Be expensive, like to learn TM. They have a sliding scale, but it's still money. But they have a deal. If you're a trauma survivor, talk to the person there and say, do you have a satisfaction guarantee? Which they do. There's some very specific things you have to do. Like you can't just say, okay, TM didn't work for me, I want a refund. But if you talk beforehand and you're a trauma survivor, you can say, what do I have to do? Like you come to a certain number of meetings and this, and if it doesn't work for you, you can get a refund. And that's part of the thing. They don't really, advertise that a lot, although if you sign up. So that's something for a trauma. If if this works for me, I pay it. If it doesn't work for me, I'm okay, for people who've experienced trauma.
And then, of course, that's the other question, whether or not you recognize the fact that you have trauma. And, as they say, the first step is recognizing that you've got a problem, admitting you've got your own problem, and I think that's a really big first step that a lot of people have to take in order to take responsibility for their own lives.
One last thing I should say, TM is great for PTSD. It's not like a cure-all. It's not like this is going to fix everything. When it works, it helps. Sometimes it helps profoundly and quickly, but I'm not trying to say that this is it and we found a cure for PTSD and it's TM. I just want to be clear, because I love it. I think, when you have something that helps, I'm psyched about that. Like I'm searching, it's hard.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. I don't want to say it's everything.
Well, you're a beautiful guy, and you're very authentic, and I really appreciate that. Let me ask you, you talked about people searching out on the web. Any good recommendations for people as we close out our time here in terms of finding out more information, where they should go, any websites, any information that you might have?
If you want to find a TM center, you go to tm.org near you if you want to learn. If you want to read about TM and find, like, what is this? Is this about me? Our boss, Bob Roth, wrote a book called Strength and Stillness. It doesn't teach you how to do TM, but it tells his story of 50 years of teaching, and it gives an idea of like
what's the book again? Say it again.
Called Strength and Stillness.
Strength and Stillness by
Bob Roth. It doesn't teach you how to do TM, but if you want to like, okay, the sound, do I want to learn that? What should I read? And if you want a TM center to learn near you, go to tm.org, and they'll, you put in your zip code and they'll be like, here's your TM center. And what you can do, they always have a free introductory talk. So you can go and hear them and be like, do I like this guy? Do I want to learn it? I don't have to pay anything. Sometimes you can do it online. So as a first step, if you're not sure, those are the two things, free introductory talk or Strength and Stillness. And,
Beautiful.
There you go.
Beautiful. Well, again, Adam, thank you so much for being here on the Mindfulness.
Oh, my pleasure.
Really appreciate it, and I look forward to learning more and being a part of the experience.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Keith. I really appreciate it. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to the Mindfulness Experience Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. We have other exciting guests coming up in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. For more mindfulness tips and tricks, visit our website at workmindfulness.com. Thanks again for being a part of the Mindfulness Experience. This is Keith Fivesen.